Getting to today's program, our speaker is a local historian and musician. He first became interested in ragtime at the age of about 11 years old, and he's been playing piano since he was a child. Right, really recently, yes. He is the author of 4 books, 3 of them kind of focused on Detroit history, and one on iconic restaurants in Ann Arbor, so tasty. And he's got all of his books here today. If you are interested, you can come up after and check those out, and he'll be available for signing and selling too. So enough of me, here to share with us the history of Detroit's ragtime and jazz age. Please help me welcome John Mylan.
Thank you very much. Actually, the book on Detroit ragtime and the jazz age was the first book I wrote, and I had the great fortune of having a lot of help from wonderful musicians, like one of our dear friends here that's actually in attendance, Carrie Price. I don't know if you know Carrie. She's a wonderful pianist, a wonderful historian and educator. And one of these days you'll have to have her back to talk about the construction of the blues. Another great individual who's no longer with us. Yes?
Could you repeat your name again? I couldn't hear it.
It's John Mylan, M-I-L-A-N, Mylan. John Mylan. Another great individual who helped with this was the great Mike Montgomery. And you will find pictures of all these wonderful people, including Carrie at the back of the book, people that are still helping ragtime stay alive and early jazz in the area. Now, a lot of people don't realize this, but when you think about ragtime music, people immediately think of Missouri. They think of Sedalia, Missouri, because Scott Joplin was writing some of the most famous rags in Sedalia, Missouri. And Missouri is kind of the seat of ragtime, Kansas City, Sedalia, and so forth. But Detroit played a very important role in the development of early jazz and ragtime. And most people don't know that today. I think this is going to help me forward this. There we go. Why was Detroit so important? Well, there's a lot of reasons. One of them is that Detroit was at the very end of the American section of the Underground Railway. So fugitive slaves who were coming on their way to Canada would come through Detroit in hopes of getting across the river. One of the most famous sites in Detroit, which is in Capitol Park, which is basically Griswold and Woodward Avenue, Griswold and Grand River Avenue, it's one block west of Woodward, was the Finney Barn. Seymour Finney owned the Finney Hotel, and he was a staunch abolitionist. And in the 1850s, fugitive slaves would come through, and he would let them stay in his barn. And the bounty hunters looking for the fugitive slaves would be staying in the hotel, having no idea that who they were looking for were in the barn. So he did a wonderful thing. And after the Civil War, a lot of the fugitive slaves who had escaped to Canada began to meander back into Detroit because they wanted to be in America. There was opportunity here, and they weren't afraid of obviously being captured. And there was a lot of incidents where people were captured. They weren't even fugitive slaves. They were just taken for the bounty anyway. If you saw the film 12 Years a Slave, that's a good example of that. What happened? How did jazz begin? We don't know all the answers. We do know that when the Civil War was over, a lot of military bands were disbanded, if you'll pardon the pun. Bands were disbanded. And a lot of musical instruments went on the market, used battered up musical instruments. And we believe that a lot of the ex-slaves, the new citizens of America, would pick up these instruments for very cheap prices, and they would try to imitate the marching bands that they heard. And if they didn't remember how they went, they might improvise a little bit. Now, improvisation was not a new thing. People have been improvising for thousands of years, obviously. But the idea that they would play something along a structure of chords and start playing something kind of like it, but that would follow that structure, was kind of part of what became the jazz tradition. We believe jazz is basically based on African American rhythms with a lot of, it's a synthesis. There were some classical elements and there was a Jewish tradition in it, in the melodic material, and you'll hear that in ragtime, a lot of passages that sound like klezmer bands. Now, in Detroit, after the Civil War, The most popular bands were African American bands. This is J.W. Johnson's band. If you had a cotillion or a ball, you would be the height of elegance if you had this African American band there playing. They would also play on the excursion boats, and there were many excursion boats coming out of Detroit. You could take an excursion boat to Belle Isle, you could take an excursion boat to Harson's Island, you could take an excursion boat to Sandusky, right? Which Cedar Point was there by the 1880s. I wouldn't ride that roller coaster back then if I were you. Now, Theodore Finney, who was not at all related to Seymour Finney, he was actually an African-American gentleman, he had an orchestra that was very popular. And by the turn of the century, he passed away, and the control of the band went to a ragtime piano player by the name of Fred Stone. And Fred Stone became one of our most important ragtime composers. He was also, as I say, the band leader and arranger for Finney's famous orchestra. And this is a picture of the Theodore Finney Band under the direction of Fred Stone. This is about 1901. And these wonderful photos, most of them came from the Azalea Hackley collection, by the way, I should say, from the Detroit Public Library. So we have a lot of these wonderful photographs. Now, in the early 1890s, Alton Warner and Bertram Whitney, whose parents were very heavily involved in Detroit business, decided they were going to get their hands into the music publishing business. And the reason the music publishing business was becoming lucrative, does anybody have any idea why? Anybody? Okay, you could sell, there's somebody who knows. Why is that, young lady? Because of player pianos. All of a sudden, people could hear this music and they wanted to hear those songs, they wanted to play those songs, right? This is before radio, right? Before television. But player pianos were starting to make it very possible to have music in your home. People liked the songs. People wanted to own the sheet music. So Warner and Whitney started the Whitney Warner Publishing Company. And it was in Detroit. There's a photograph of it. There it was on Woodward. And they found this young lady named Effie Kamen, who was a piano teacher, and she had written this fancy piece called The Dance of the Brownies. And they gave her $10 and said, we want to publish this. They sold 500,000 copies. So Effie sold out cheap, all right? And they thought, wow, we are on our way to Easy Street, right? But everybody was publishing in those days. And you know, competition will really put a damper on your efforts. Another place that was publishing was the Willard Bryant Music Store, which was also in Detroit. And they had a piano player there who was sampling songs for people, who was demonstrating songs, named Harry P. Guy. And Harry P. Guy wrote a piece called Echoes from the Snowball Club, which became a big hit. And this is the very early years of ragtime. Okay? This was actually a ragtime waltz. So it's kind of a syncopated waltz. Now, Harry P. Guy called it Echoes from the Snowball Club. We don't know exactly why. It's considered a little bit of a zets at white America, but we do kind of know. Because if you were in one of these very, very popular black bands, these African-American bands, the white musicians in Detroit were resentful of your business that you were getting, and they called it the Snowball Club. Okay? So Harry P. Guy, in a little bit of a zets back, said, okay, well, these are some echoes from the Snowball Club. Became a very popular piece of music, and a very rare photo from the Hackley collection in the Library of Congress as well. This is actually the front entrance of the Willard Bryant Music Store in Detroit, Michigan. It's about 1900. And right here is Harry P. Guy. And you can see there's a piano, and on the piano is a copy of Echoes of the Snowball Club. And it's also in the window being sold at the top there. So they were very proud of the fact that their piano demonstrator, their piano song demonstrator, was selling this material that he wrote. And here's the interior. There's only one known photograph of the interior of Willard Bryant. And the fellow at the piano there is Harry P. Guy. I mean, we hope maybe he's playing Echoes of the Snowball Club, right? And this is a very unusual opportunity to see something like this. You just don't see photographs like this. Now, Whitney and Warner soon discovered there was too much competition and they were not making a lot of money. They weren't making millions like they were hoping to. So they talked their friend Jerome Remick into trying to buy into the just luxurious and exciting world of music publishing, not telling him that they were in big trouble financially. Now, Jerome Remick owned the Detroit Creamery, which was probably the most important, the most successful dairy firm in the city. And they made ice cream, and they had farms in the outer regions. And he thought, well, this sounds like a great opportunity. So he gave them $5,000 to Whitney and Warner so he could be a partner. And he soon found out they were almost bankrupt. But he was not to be dissuaded. He found a friend in Fred Stone who ran the Finney Band. And Fred Stone wrote a piece of music called My Ragtime Baby. Now, remind you, this is in the late 1890s. The term ragtime was almost not used until this period of time. We know there were probably evidence of rags and ragtime at the World's Fair in Chicago in 1893. We don't know exactly who was there, but the term ragtime was not appearing much until about 1895 with William H. Crowell's Mississippi Rag. This is about 1898. My Ragtime Baby became a big hit. It was published in Detroit. It became a hit nationally. And it brought Whitney Warner back. And Remick was kind of hailed as the savior of the Whitney Warner Publishing Company. And about a year later, Fred Stone got his brother Charles Stone to write lyrics, and they made it into a song. And this was part and parcel of the business in those days. You got a popular tune that's an instrumental, let's make it into a song too and sell it twice, right? Recycle that. So Fred Stone became quite a popular writer. Here's a large collection of some of the great things he wrote, waltzes and marches and rags. The larger one here is the Bosun Rag, which was written for the bosuns along the Detroit River. And I'll give you a little taste of the Fred Stone's Bosun's Rag from 1898. This was a Detroit hit before Motown. Thank you. That was the Boasted Rag, and that was a pretty big hit too. And he made a big hit out of the Silks and Rags. He wrote the Belle of the Philippines, which was also kind of popular. A lot of Fred Stone's music was very popular, and he was quite prolific. And he ended his career with a famous tune that everybody knows and loves called the Detroit Wholesalers March in Two-Step. Actually, Fred Stone fell off a streetcar in 1912, and he hit his head, and that was the end of Fred. And that was not the best swan song to end with, the Detroit Wholesalers March in Two-Step, but what are you going to do? In the meantime, Scott Joplin was a huge success in Missouri. He had written the original rags. He followed that up with the Maple Leaf Rag, which became probably the most famous of all rags, and it made him the uncrowned king of ragtime music. Now, this was also very important to Jerome Remick. He was looking for something he could do to bring ragtime to Detroit so that he could bring popularity to the music he was publishing. Now, he couldn't bring Scott Joplin here, but he did notice that the fellow known for arranging it was a man named Charles N. Daniels. Charles N. Daniels did not arrange the original rags. Scott Joplin needed no help arranging. He was a graduate of the music school. But Charles N. Daniels was very good at getting his name on things. And he was also a good writer himself. But Remick was aware of this. He also came in contact with a piece of music called the Creole Bells. And this is in 1900. Creole Bells was another huge seller. Like My Ragtime Baby, Creole Bells, which was written by J. Boatwell and Lamp, sold almost 1 million copies. Now, people still hear this piece today, and it was, as I say, written in 1900. It was recorded in 1900 on what would become the Victor record label. And if you were able to find that today, you would be the only person that ever found that. No one has ever found a copy of that record. But it would be the first recorded ragtime piano solo. And this is the Creole Bells. That's the Creole Bell. That was another big hit for Remick. It was published by a very small publisher for about 10 minutes in New York, and Remick got a hold of it and he published it. You can see here it still says Whitney Warner, but Remick was going to change that very quickly. He was going to call it Remick. And his vision was to make it the biggest publishing company in the world. And he succeeded. The Jerome Remick Company did become the largest publishing company in the world. And what most people don't realize today is even though it's not in Detroit, it's still the largest publishing company in the world. Today it's called MCA. Now, Charles N. Daniels wrote a piece of music called Hiawatha. He didn't hit his microphone like I did, but he wrote a piece of music called Hiawatha. As I said, he got his name on Scott Joplin's original rags, but he wrote a piece called Hiawatha, which is kind of a ragtime piece of music. It's an intermezzo, they would call it, kind of an idyll. And at that time, people were kind of romanticizing the Native Americans, the American Indians. And he caught the eye of Jerome Remick because Remick wanted Hiawatha. And here's a copy of Hiawatha. And he gave $10,000 to Charles and Daniels to come to Detroit and let him publish Hiawatha. And in return, Charles and Daniels wanted to be pretty much the A&R man for the publishing company and have a very high post in Detroit. And he took it. Hiawatha sold over 1 million copies. And again, it was originally a instrumental and then a song. Okay, and that was the way to do it. You just follow up 1, 2. This is like the age of disco, right? I mean, all of a sudden everybody wanted an Indian intermezzo, and by golly, there were plenty of Indian intermezzos. This is just a handful. There were hundreds of Indian intermezzos. You see Chautauqua and the Indian two-step, Seminole, Queen of the Prairie. Red Wing was one of the most famous. Does everybody know Red Wing? Anybody know Red Wing? I know you do. Everybody knows Red Wing. Whoops. Everybody know that? Yeah. That was one of the most popular. That's not all of it. That's just a part of it. But everybody knows that. That was written by Cary Mills, who was from Detroit. He was the head of the violin department at the University of Michigan. But he went to New York. This was not published in Detroit. Red Wing was published in New York by his own firm. And he was quite a popular writer himself. But we did publish Hiawatha here, and then a very well-known ragtime composer named Charles L. Johnson, who was from Kansas City, wrote an Indian intermezzo called Iola. Iola is probably the most famous of all Indian intermezzos. It came out as an instrumental, and then it came out as a song. Remick published them all, and he made a fortune. Now you say, well, I never heard of Iola. Has anybody heard of Iola? Well, you actually have heard of Iola. I don't think there's anybody in this room who has not heard Iola. It was written in 1906, and you're not going to know it by the beginning, which goes like this. You can hear the dancing of the Indians, you know, Indians dancing around. Okay, what's the famous part? Maybe this part. You know that one? What do you call that tune? Does anybody, what do you call that? You all know it, right? Yeah. What did you call it? Go, oh, say, oh, playmate, slide down my rain barrel. There you go. It's amazing that we have in our minds, in our consciousness, this ragtime tune that was published 112 years ago. And to this day, even our grandchildren, our children know this tune. So it was quite a hit. And it certainly put Remick on the map. And you can see by this time, it says the Jerome Remick Publishing Company, right? So he succeeded in taking over the place. And he built a new building to house his publishing company, and it was on Farmer Street, and it's still there today. How many of you have been to Vicente's Cuban restaurant? Down on, okay, there you go. Now they added a few stories over the years, and it doesn't look like this inside today, but this is a great picture of the inside of Remick in about 1906. And you can see a lot of people there just kind of going through stuff and going through mail and orders and so forth. And there's a lot of sheet music in there, getting ready to process those orders and mail them out. But here's a picture of what it looks like today. You can see they added on about 4 more stories. I guess about 3 more stories, actually. And it's a wonderful place. If you get a chance to go there, they have this wonderful menu of Cuban food. And I've actually lectured this lecture at that location because a group called Drunk History asked me if I would lecture where the Remick Publishing Company used to be housed. So there you have it.
What's the name again?
The restaurant is Vicente's. It's on Library Street. It's right behind where the old Hudson building was, which is, I guess it's going to be the location of the largest building in Detroit now. I guess they broke ground of that. So much is happening in Detroit.
Detroit Opera.
Pardon me?
It's a good dining place if you're going to the Detroit Opera.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so many restaurants in Detroit now. How many have been down recently in the last year or two? Just an amazing change has occurred there. It's wonderful to see it. Now, in the meantime, as you might imagine, Jerome Remick was becoming quite wealthy. And they noticed it in New York. In fact, he opened a New York office, but he maintained the headquarters in Detroit. And they called him the Colossus of Detroit. And there is a caricature of him from about 1909. And when he would come to New York to check on his New York facility, they would treat him like a king. And he was publishing things left and right. He also had a stable of musicians and writers in Detroit who would become very prominent and important writers as well. And he also had a bevy of female writers too. We had a group of ragtime women, and several of them worked for Remick. They also worked as secretaries too, so it wasn't the most prestigious place to be standing, but times were still changing. As I said, there were shuttle services, passenger cruiser lines to all of the islands and amusement parks and different sites along the Great Lakes. This is a piece of sheet music for the Tajmu Park Waltz, which was written by William Finzel. The Finzel family had a band also in the turn of the century. They were a Caucasian group, and I think the Finzel family is still prominent in the Detroit area. I think they had some presence with the Detroit Symphony even, but at the turn of the century, they had control over one of the cruise lines. This one went to Harson's Island. How many of you heard of Tajmu Park? All right, very good. Tajmu Park was on Harson's Island. And this is the Tajmu. There's another picture of it up here. And it burned to the waterline in the 1930s, but it was quite popular while the amusement park was open. As I say, before there was a bridge to Belle Isle, people would take an excursion cruise to Belle Isle. They would go to Boblo. They would go to Sandusky. And each of these cruise lines had their own orchestra. So you could be a working musician in Detroit at that time and be paid pretty well. There was also a band shell. There still is a band shell, I think, but in Belle Isle you could go and see music there. It was the age of live music, and if you wrote tunes, you would want some of the vaudevillians to sing your tune in Detroit, in Chicago, in New York, or at the Chautauquas, anywhere you could get it heard, and you would want to get somebody to play it so that the publisher would want to publish it, right? And so at this point in time, the writers had control more so than the performers, because this was at the very beginning of commercial music. We just got a sense of how we could sell music on records, but we didn't realize how important the performer himself was or herself was. We did know that Al Jolson was popular. We did know that Sophie Tucker was possible. But for the most part, when music started being recorded, a lot of the industry experts thought people would buy 3 or 4 records and never buy another one again. Why would I need any more records, right? I've got 3 records. You want to hear them? That soon became a myth, that was quickly deflated. And before we had radio, there was another phenomenon about music. You see these, I mentioned the Detroit Wholesalers March in Two-Step by Fred Stone, his swan song. But we also have here a whole collection of advertising sheet music. The Dime Savings Bank Novelette Gavotte. Right? Everybody wanted a copy of the Dime Savings Bank Gavotte. Quality March in Two-Step, which was a featured tune of Yost Furriers of Detroit. So in other words, before radio and television, if you wanted to advertise your product, you would have somebody write a piece of music about it, right? And there's all kinds of evidence of this kind of stuff. The Faultless Pajama Girl. Yes?
What's a gavotte?
Well, a gavotte is a type of dance that was popular in the 19th and early 20th century. I think it has roots actually in the 18th century. Carrie, are you familiar with the origin of the gavotte?
French in the 18th century.
Okay, so there you go. Pardon me?
What did she say?
It's French and from the 18th century. I thought you were going to ask me to demonstrate, and I was going to ask you to leave.
It's in 4/4, and it always starts on the 3rd beat of the first time.
There you go. Don't say we never tell you nothing. Now I'm going to share with you another part of the industry that was very prominent. Now, everybody who made furniture wanted to start making phonographs, right? Because it's a box and I could put a phonograph in it. Everybody who wanted to sell pianos wanted to publish sheet music. And so we had this golden age here in Detroit. This is the Grinnell Company. How many remember Grinnell's? Everybody remembers Grinnell's. This was their advertising piece of music. The March of Progress souvenir sheet of Grinnell's grand opening on Woodward in 1908. You see, and it's got pictures of all their locations. This building is still standing, actually, along Woodward. How many remember going to Grinnell's downtown? I remember my mother taking me there. Yeah. And this is a picture of the inside of Grinnell's in about 1909, I think that is. And you can see these wonderful shelves of music. You can see a second story. The ladies are all up on the spiral stairway. There's sheet music laid out on the counter there. For a sheet music collector like me or Carrie, I think we wish we had a time machine. We could just go shopping. Just imagine what you'd find there, right? This was a great age for the piano, okay? In fact, there were more pianos in homes at this time than today. And I mean, and we're talking percentages too. People just do not have pianos like they did in those days. This is about 1909. This is 1908, okay? And of course, Grinnell was around until, I think, the late 1980s, early 1990s. I don't know if you have a handle on that, but they did finally sell out. And a lot of the pianos, most of the manufacturers are in Asia and Europe now. We have one, what's that?
I just said that's a shame.
Oh, it's a shame, yeah. Well, they're expensive to make, and they don't sell that well. We have Steinway, which is still, pretty much a homemade product and a very successful product. Now, ragtime was on the wane. Just like every style of music we know, ragtime had a beginning and an end. And it started about 1895. And by about 1916, it had kind of run its course. Now, the kind of pieces you would have called rags by that time, they started calling one-steps. And a lot of these early songwriters of jazz were kind of coming out of the woodwork and writing pieces of music. The band you see here was not from Detroit. This band here came from New Orleans, and they came north to share what they called Dixieland music. Now, they were white, and so they kind of had free reign. They could come north, they could play, and everybody found them palatable because they were Caucasian. They called themselves the original Dixieland Jazz Band. They came to Chicago, and then they went to New York. And they had a whole collection of their own music. And they made a record in 1916. On one side they put the Livery Stable Blues, which had animal noises on it. And on the other side they put the Dixieland One-Step, the original Dixieland One-Step. No one knew how to record a band like this at the time. And the reason is they were usually recording somebody's voice or a piano, or they'd have an orchestra in the background and the singer would be there. And it was all acoustic. And what does that mean? It means that everything you performed, you sang, you played, would go into a horn and it would etch into the wax, into the master, what was being played. You put these 5 guys in a room and they all start playing as loud as they can and they couldn't hear anything. It was just very difficult to record this stuff. And they found out very quickly that this big baby here was drowning out everyone. So they told the drummer, you got to leave this bass drum out. You can only play on the snare and the cymbal, right? And they had no idea how this was going to work. They went to Columbia, who was, of course, a big recording company at the turn of the century there, 1916. And they recorded a tune called The Darktown Strutter's Ball. How many know that one? Yeah. And Columbia listened to it, and they thought it was horrible. They said, no one's going to buy this. We don't want you. No contract. So they went down the road in New York, and they went to the Victor. And they recorded the Livery Stable Blues and the Dixieland One-Step. And much to Columbia's chagrin, this record sold over 1 million copies. It was the beginning of the jazz age. And these guys became almost like the Beatles of their time, okay? These guys were in demand everywhere. Now I'll play you the original Dixieland One-Step, and I'll tell you why. Interestingly enough, if you sell 1 million copies of anything, what's going to happen in many cases is you're going to get sued, right? Because everybody wants a piece of the action. They got sued for both sides of the record. This is the Dixieland One-Step. And you may have heard this. This is considered a jazz standard. Thank you. This is a lovely oak piano. I love this. The Dixieland One-Step, which you just heard, how many of you heard that before? The most famous theme is this here. Became a huge hit. And within about a month, they got sued by Joe Jordan, who said, that is my teasin' rag. And then he said, no, it's not. No, it's not. So they went to trial, and the judge listened. He said, let's hear the Dixieland one step. It goes like this. How does the tease and rag go? Right. It was definitely that tease and rag. And this was not unusual at the time. They got sued by an old clarinet player for the livery stable blues on the other side. Two different judgments came down. The judgment was this was in fact that tease and rag, and they had to say so on the record. So if you find anything of that record after the first 3 or 4 months, it will say, introducing that tease and rag by Joe Jordan, and they had to pay him for the royalties. The other side, they were challenged by Alcide Nunez, who said, that is my piece of music, I wrote the livery stable blues. And the judge at that time listened to all these blues songs, and he said, you know what? You can't tell one blues from another. And so outside of the lyrical content, or if there was a very, very obvious melody line, you really couldn't protect blues lines at that time. So he didn't win that case. But the Dixieland Jazz Band had made their mark, and everybody wanted jazz. And Remick was no stranger to the idea of changing with the times. So he found within the environs of Detroit a lot of people who could write music that would turn out to be some of the great songwriters of all time. Also, at that time, the Detroit Athletic Club got a hold of this Russian pianist named Gene Goldkat, and they asked him if he would become the music director for all the music proceedings at the Detroit Athletic Club. He said, sure. And in the meantime, the University of Michigan opened a ballroom along Woodward Avenue called the Greystone. How many of you remember the Greystone Ballroom? Well, they asked Gene Goldkat if he would run it, book it, control it. And he said, sure. And he also put together an orchestra. Okay? How many of you ever heard of the Gene Goldkat Orchestra? Carrie Price, okay. I bring her everywhere because she knows what I'm going to add. Now, Gene Goldkat's orchestra was assembled by young musicians playing this early form of jazz. And he was able to entice a lot of musicians here that had just started in the business. This is the early 20s. And Goldkat didn't play with the band, but he put together some great guys. And including, I should say, Tommy Dorsey, who was just a kid, Jimmy Dorsey. Eventually he would bring in Joe Venuti and Eddie Lang, a lot of wonderful players. And eventually he enticed a young man named Bix Beiderbecke. How many have heard of Bix Beiderbecke? Probably the Jimi Hendrix of the 1920s, right? At the same time, Remick was publishing wonderful stuff by Detroit writers. Here's some very famous tunes that were written in Detroit. The Japanese Sandman, Richard Whiting, Raymond Egan, they both came from Detroit. There's 4 guys that were, who are billed as writing Sleepy Time Gal. I don't know how 4 guys write a tune. But they wrote that at one of 2 bars up north. Both bars claim that this is where Sleepy Time Gal was written. But those were big hits, and of course, Honey. How many know Honey? I'm in love with you, honey. Yes, so here we have some wonderful names. Seymour Simons, Haven Gillespie, Richard Whiting. Richard Whiting was probably the most prolific of all the Detroit songwriters, right? He wrote Louise, My Ideal, just an incredible amount of songs. Most of these guys did not live into beyond the 1940s, but these were Detroit's great songwriters. Seymour Simons went with Gerald Marks to write All of Me, another great Detroit song. So these were great boons for Jerome Remick, obviously. Here's a song that nobody knows called You Are Just a Vision. And this was published in Battle Creek by the Charles Rote Company. Okay? Charles wrote, made furniture and refrigerators, and he also published music. Why not, right? But this is a song written by Gene Goldcat along with his orchestra. There's a picture of the orchestra on the cover. It includes the Dorsey brothers and Charles Horvath and Howdy Quicksell. In fact, Howdy Quicksell wrote the words to the tune. It's only important because it was written by Goldcat and featured them on the cover. They actually never recorded the tune. This is a picture of the Wolverines, who was probably the most important band of the early 20s, most important white band, because the African-American band at that time was King Oliver's Creole Jazz Band, and King Oliver had brought north Louis Armstrong. And both these bands were being recorded in Richmond, Indiana, which of course is a recording hub, right? You want to make it big, you record in Richmond, Indiana. But they had recorded on a label called Jeanette. And when Goldcat heard about Bix Beiderbecke, he wanted to put him in the band. And he did ultimately put him in the orchestra. So this was the band that was down at the Greystone Ballroom in the 1920s. And eventually it was the band that Paul Whiteman robbed. He just said, I got to have everybody in this band. And he took them away from Gene Goldcat. But this was the heyday of jazz in Detroit. And there was another reason that Detroit was really important musically in the 20s. Does anybody have an idea why? Prohibition. The second most lucrative industry in Detroit was illicit alcohol. Second only to the auto industry. You could get booze from across the river so easily it wasn't funny, right? However, the whole industry was run by the Purple Gang, and if they caught you bringing liquor across the border, you were in big trouble. Here's the interior of the Greystone Ballroom. Another band that Goldcat ran and managed was the McKinney's Cotton Pickers. How many have heard of the McKinney's Cotton Pickers? Okay, we got 3 or 4. The McKinney's Cotton Pickers, they didn't like their name, by the way, was mostly taken from Cecil Scott's Jazz Bandits out of Columbus, Ohio. And they featured some great musicians. Probably the last surviving member was a person that Carrie and I both knew really well, a wonderful person named Dave Wilborn, who actually organized the new McKinneys in the 1970s. And in fact, his last performance, he passed away just after he finished, was at Ted's. You know where Ted's used to be down here? Yeah. He was getting a standing ovation, as I understand it. And what a way to go, right? Yeah. But this is the fountain in the Greystone Ballroom. You can see the cherub, which still exists somewhere. I've seen it. There was for a while, there was a Greystone Museum, and they had the cherub from the fountain. The Greystone, unfortunately, is long gone. If you want to see the Greystone, you go down Woodward, and you will see the McDonald's. And that's where the Greystone Ballroom used to be. So, what are you going to do? But by this time, the jazz age was changing. Whiteman took Goldcat's band. Remick continued to be a very important publishing company, but Remick died in 1931, and it soon became known as Kite and Engel, and it was initially absorbed by Santley and by some other companies, and a conglomerate became MCA. The last thing I'll show you here was a piece that was written by Gene Goldcat and Ann Campbell, who was a writer for the Detroit Free Press. This was called The Song of Detroit in 1931, published by the Crowley, Milner and Company. That was it. I don't think, did anybody ever call it Milner? We just said Crowley's. So that's pretty much the story of Detroit and the influence it had on ragtime and jazz. So I hope that's informative. Does anybody have any questions? Yes?
What is all this business about 2-steps and 1-steps? I mean, is 2-step ragtime, or is it something else? Or is it a dance they did?
Well, those are dances, okay? And like a foxtrot or a 1-step or a 2-step.
It has nothing to do with the music.
Well, it does. Do you have a way to define that for them? Carrie. You could probably do a 1-step or a 2-step to a same piece of music, but it's just how you do the dance. And if the popular dance at the time was a foxtrot or a one-step or a two-step, you would call it that but generally a two-step or a one-step isn't 2/4 or 4/4 cut time. It's just 2/2. Yes?
And so where did rag come from?
All right. The term ragtime, that is it's not an easy question to answer, and no one can actually answer it without any debate. People thought that it initially was called ragtime because people said it came out in ragged time. There's that syncopated kind of broken time. All right. Carrie, do you have any other input on where
Ragged time.
Yeah. Uneven music, yeah.
The newspapers
Pardon me?
no, are it magazines or newspapers that were called rags?
They're called rags, yeah, but that's a derogative term. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
If I may say something, interested in the dance, there's so much re-interest in the early jazz dances all over the place. Bars are having dance nights. Those kids would be able to tell you about one-step and two-step. There are dance clubs in both every college. Ann Arbor has a huge dance club, and they're doing the old dances.
Have you been?
I've played where they come in.
You know, and I will say this, Carrie's quite right about that. And every year, and this is, I think, the 28th year, we are playing the Ragtime Ball, which is on February 10th. If you're interested, anyone can go. There's a fee for attending. It's in Ann Arbor at the Zalgaz Grotto Club. Go to vintagedance.com and you will see the details. But they will teach you the dances during the day. And then you will come at night. They'll show you how to do a one-step. They'll show you how to do a two-step. They'll show you how to do a tango, a ragtime tango, and a ragtime waltz. So as Carrie says, it's really popular. These are not young people for the most part, but it's, everyone's welcome. But I know what she means. There's a lot of swing dancers and so forth. So anyway, you might want to tune into that. Yes?
How about the Darktown Strutters Ball?
The Darktown Strutters Ball was a big hit. It was written by Shelton Brooks, who was from Canada. And he came to Detroit briefly, and then he moved on to New York. But it was published actually in New York. You're all familiar with the Darktown Strutters Ball. That's the kind of tune that people are a little wary of playing today because the term Darktown has a racially disturbing connotation to it. But of course, it was a big hit. I'm sorry,
Yes, was the ragtime, I know jazz eventually went to Europe, but were any of these bands ever traveling to Europe? Did they introduce ragtime?
Oh, sure.
Because we heard
Well,
a lot of playing here, but I mean, do they
yes.
go to Europe?
Even in the turn of the century, ragtime bands were going to Europe, and as Carrie said, dance was big at the time, as we've already discussed. So you had Vernon and Irene Castle, and James Reese Europe's band went to Europe before World War I. It had a lot of touring bands, and people loved ragtime in Europe. It was a big craze there as well. Same thing with jazz, and you will see a lot of things on English labels and French labels and German labels where they're trying to imitate American music because that became the music,
So much of the music is started in America.
Well, those types did, yes. Blues, ragtime, jazz, absolutely. Yeah.
Can you play a little bit of the Seminole rag?
No, I don't know the Seminole rag. Are you a Seminole?
Yes. I mean, I came from Florida and I remember hearing it. And
Is that right? Well, you know what? There's so many ragtime. What's that?
How about your partner? Can she?
No, nobody. Listen, nobody knows that piece of music. It's very obscure. It was just one of the many Indian intermezzos. But it's funny, I actually am part Seminole too. My grandfather was born on a government compound in Lyons, Georgia. So
I remember going out to the Miccosukee Reservation and seeing all the Seminoles and the when they would wrestle the alligators. And
Wow.
with all their beautiful clothes, they were all tiny little pieces of fabric.
isn't it something? Yeah.
It was really interesting.
Well, you know more about it than I do. I do know that my grandfather was orphaned and sent to the Indian Territory, which was Oklahoma. But
And Florida
There you go. There you are. We're not going to mess with that one. Yes.
What is the connection or disconnection between the jazz in the 50s when Detroit was a real center for jazz in the 50s and the 60s? You know, the Brubeck thing and all that.
Right, right.
Is there a connection or a disconnection, or did World War II have something to do with the change?
Well, modern jazz and 52nd Street jazz and bebop, they're all related to jazz as we knew it in the 20s. But that jazz, the music based on a chord structure, a very strong chord structure, mostly, very often associated with a song. If you listen to a record in the 1920s, like Sam Lannon's band, and you listen to, say, a Beatles record in the 60s, you'll see that the idea of these songs with some solo work in the middle, jazz of that nature really transmogrified into what we call rock and roll, okay? With some help from the rhythm and blues. The stuff that you hear, the 52nd Street jazz, it started there, but it's kind of an offshoot. There's a little bit of a more of a free form, a little bit more of a veering away from that structured chord structure, and it's a little more experimental.
Just like classical music has become, where are they?
Yeah.
What are they doing? I understand Beethoven, I understand Mozart. It's the same orchestra, but they're playing something just experimental almost.
Right. Yeah, you could listen to, as Carrie said, you could listen to Beethoven and say, I love it. Somebody will say, well, here's some John Cage, and say, turn it off, okay? Because I don't know what he's doing, you know. Same thing with jazz. If you listen to Miles Davis in the 50s, you could still feel a little bit of that older passion that you loved about the 20s. By the time he gets to the NAACP concert in the early 60s, it's like, I'm not sure I even know what the heck you're playing, you know. But there are people that love that. It's just going off in a different tangent, quite a ways. Yes.
Is the Warner and Whitney connected to the Whitney Hotel at all?
Is what? I'm sorry.
Warner and Whitney label connected to the Whitney Hotel at all downtown?
Well, no, I don't think directly. Now, Whitney was a lumber baron, you know, the Whitney Mansion, and the J.C. Whitney Company was a company that did sewing machines in the turn of the century, in the 1870s. So those families were probably related, but I don't think there's any business interest still related to that family anymore. But it's a great restaurant. Yes, John.
Comment, there are still pockets of ragtime around. As you probably know, Sedalia, Missouri still has a ragtime festival.
They do. I have never been there. Carrie, have you been to the Rag Festival in Sedalia?
Frank
Oh.
has one each of this year.
Yeah, well, that is your program, isn't it, Carrie?
I do a couple days there.
Yeah,
20th and 21st this year. Zender puts it on, information on the website. Great show.
there are some wonderful festivals. There's a Big Spiderbeck Festival in Davenport, Iowa every year. There's a Big Spiderbeck Festival in Libertyville, Illinois. So if you really want to see what's left of the music, every Sunday you can go to the Zalgaz Grotto in Ann Arbor, and you can see Jim DePogny's Chicago Jazz Band. Do they call it that anymore? It's just as Bill Ogilvy's. And Carrie here hosts a wonderful program of music every, what is it, the first Thursdays? What at Dakota Inn?
Well, that's not jazz, that's sing-along.
Well, but it's still the older music. All right, it's not jazz, it's sing-along, but Carrie's there. How many of you been to the Dakota Inn? All right, well,
Where have you been?
yeah. It is a really wonderful and very unusual place. Anybody else? Yes.
What's going on with Baker's Keyboard? Are they too far out nowadays, or do they play the old stuff, or what?
You know, I have never been to Baker's. What do you know about it?
Shame on you.
I know.
That's history.
It's pretty modern.
Really, it's
You have to watch and see who's coming in. If you recognize the name, they might play something you recognize. Never heard of them before.
then it's.
Good luck.
Yes.
Just a little bit of that Darktown Strutters Ball.
The Darktown Strutters Ball. Carrie, can you play the Darktown Strutters Ball? All right, ladies and gentlemen, Carrie Price. Woo! All right, yeah. Wonderful. Well, thank you all. The book is here available, and there are 20 if you want them today. And if you have any more questions or comments, let me know, okay?